Hello, welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Guy Murphy. Today my guest is Ben Hipwell, who works at the University of Newcastle in the Bacterial Regulation and Transport Lab, and we'll be talking about antibacterial resistance and the microbiome. Thank you for joining me on the show today, Ben.
No worries, Guy. Thanks for having me.
Could you tell us what got you working in research in this area?
I was never really a fan of biology in high school. I did physics and chemistry, but then I gave biology a try once I hit university, and I was really interested in it. Specifically, once I got to placement in my degree, I worked with a company called Ethanol Technologies Limited, or ESTEC, and they work to make biofuels with agricultural and forestry waste. And they produce ethanol essentially with yeast. And it really got me interested in, I guess, the power of the microbe, the potential in the microbial world, how powerful and useful bacteria and yeast can be. And then during COVID, my supervisor, or my PhD supervisor, Karl Hassan, offered me a PhD scholarship in doing some antibiotic research. And I guess here I am now. I just found the work really compelling, really interesting, and bacteria are so common in our lives. Antibiotic resistance is becoming an increasing threat. And I thought it was something very important to work on, and I've been enjoying the work very much.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. And you've just finished your PhD. Congratulations, by the way. Can you tell us a little bit? Not a problem. Could you tell us a little bit more about your research in that and the implications it has for our health?
So it's a bit, So my research was in antibiotic research. So the skinny of it is that we had two antibiotics that were designed by my other supervisor and one of his collaborators that were designed to kill bacteria, or treat bacterial infections rather. But two of the antibiotics that they designed, they killed bacteria, but the mechanism of action wasn't what they predicted, and essentially they couldn't figure out how the antibiotic worked. So my project, in essence, was to help uncover the mechanism of action of these antibiotics, how they kill bacteria and how they resolve bacterial infections.
Okay.
This is especially useful. Well, knowing the mechanism of action of a drug is especially useful because in bacteria can sort of mount resistance to antibiotics. And if you understand how an antibiotic works, you can sort of predict how a bacteria might become resistant to those drugs. And then that helps clinicians better prescribe those drugs. It essentially helps for researchers and clinicians to better understand how the drug should be used.
Okay, interesting. And you mentioned that they found, that this mechanism wasn't working in the way that they initially hypothesized. Would you mind clarifying a little bit more about what that means in terms of, these mechanisms? Yeah,
absolutely. So these drugs were designed to inhibit a process called transcription. So you might be aware of, genetic information in all life, not just bacteria, but humans as well, goes from DNA to RNA to protein. So transcription is the process in which DNA is read, and then you get a transcript, or you get a transcript produced by a molecule called RNA polymerase. So this transcript is required to then turn that sequence of mRNA into protein. So essentially, DNA is the instruction manual, RNA or messenger RNA is the instruction, and then the protein essentially is the act of doing, it sort of carries out the instruction. So bacterial RNA polymerases have a unique structure compared to human bacterial RNA polymerases. So my supervisors designed these drugs to inhibit bacterial RNA polymerase. But in the assays that they carried out, it turns out that these antibiotics didn't actually inhibit bacterial transcription, but these antibiotics still killed bacteria. So okay. My project was to figure out how they did that.
Right, interesting. And could you please explain to us what bacterial resistance actually is and how it arises?
Yeah, of course. So I guess to start with, if you think if you've got a bacterial infection, typically the treatment to that bacterial infection will be antibiotics. So in a general population of bacteria, especially in an infection environment, you may have a few of those bacteria that are just more resistant to the antibiotic because of a mutation or a gene that picked up from another bacteria in something called horizontal gene transfer. So if those slightly more resistant bacteria survive the treatment, those bacteria can then reproduce and then essentially re-arise as resistant bacteria. So essentially you'll have enriched the population of bacteria in an infection environment with resistant bacteria. So even if this resistant bacteria doesn't, cause an infection again in the host, what can happen is, like let's say for example, I took some antibiotics for an infection I had, some resistant bacteria arose, and I go out into the community, and then I can spread that resistant bacteria to someone. That bacteria can potentially cause an infection in that person. The process is then repeated. And then upon repeated exposure of these bacteria to these antibiotics, you can then have antibiotic resistance sort of arise.
Okay, interesting. So you mentioned that there's a genetic component to this, is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So is there, a genetic predisposition towards being vulnerable or not vulnerable to bacteria?
Yes, absolutely. So antibiotics will kill bacteria. For example, the reason why bacteria or antibiotics kill bacteria and don't harm our cells or harm our cells less is that these bacteria have specific structures. So like I said, the RNA polymerase in bacteria is different from our RNA polymerase. Their cell makeups are different, and this is sort of dictated by the genes that they have. So based on the genetic information that a bacteria has, that will sort of change the structure of those bacterial structures, and then will change the way they interact with antibiotics. And that can happen in a number of ways as well.
And since the discovery of penicillin, is it common consensus that antibiotics have been overprescribed?
Yes. So I think that would absolutely be the consensus. So one major thing is misprescription or overprescription of antibiotics, especially in the clinic. So I remember even when I was young, I would have a respiratory illness that, my mum would take me to the doctor, mum and dad would take me to the doctor, and then I'd get a prescription of antibiotics to treat that respiratory infection. So chances are that respiratory infection would have been caused by a virus. But the antibiotics don't actually do anything to resolve viral infections. The only thing that you can really do to resolve those is, plenty of bed rest, plenty of fluids, take it easy, Panadol, Nurofen, that type of stuff. But it can be quite, confronting. It can be quite difficult for parents to take their young child to a GP with a respiratory illness, viral respiratory illness, only to be told there's nothing to be done. So it's quite common, or was quite common for GPs to prescribe antibiotics as a placebo. So I think the number is, as of 2019, 70% of GPs had reported as prescribing people placebos, and antibiotics actually made up the vast majority of these placebos.
Right.
So one thing as well that can happen is that some people will also self-medicate with antibiotics. So I know people in my life, they will have been given antibiotics for an infection, they won't finish the course, and they'll hold on to those antibiotics to treat a recurrent infection in the future, even if those antibiotics aren't appropriate for that infection. And going even crazier beyond or further beyond is that I've heard of people purchasing antibiotics off of the dark web to treat infections, and then also people buying antibiotics designed to treat bacterial infections in ornamental fish, but then they'll take those antibiotics themselves. So a lot of misuse of antibiotics and a lot of overprescription of antibiotics in the clinic has definitely led to an increase in antibiotic resistance over time.
Yeah, wow. I was not aware that, people purchased antibiotics on the dark web. That's very strange to me.
Oh, yeah. I think it's definitely appropriate in that doctors will withhold antibiotics when they're not appropriate, but people, unfortunately, do take matters into their own hands, which can cause issues.
Right, okay. So I've noticed that some meat packaging around in supermarkets these days features marketing based around being antibiotic-free. Is antibiotic resistance an issue that extends beyond prescribed medication?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I've been railing a little bit against people, misusing antibiotics, people being, practitioners misprescribing antibiotics or overprescribing antibiotics. There's a huge amount of antibiotic use in a really wide ranging number of applications. So it's quite common to have antibiotics or antimicrobials in cosmetics, in consumer goods. And like you said, there's a major use, the major prevalence of antibiotic use in agriculture, especially for livestock. A bit of an interesting history, actually. So after, I guess it was like in the latter end of World War II, when industrial scale production of antibiotics really started to pick up, they discovered that antibiotics, the supplementation of antibiotics into animal feed was actually a really effective growth promoter in these in livestock. And this was especially important as, we had a massive, most countries had a massive population boom post-World War II. Increasing demand for meat really meant that people, that farmers, along with the advent of industrial farming, the use of antibiotics in animal feed also increased substantially, or started, and then, antibiotics started to be used extensively
right.
In agricultural feed.
Okay.
It is really important for, antibiotic use in animals is really important because you do need to treat bacterial infections in animals. You also need to prevent bacterial infections in animals as well. But a major problem is that you had low or subclinical dosages of antibiotics being put into animal feed. I think the last number I read was, I guess this number was quite some time ago, but as of 2001, nearly 90% of all antibiotics produced in the US were used in agriculture. But the risk of this is that you've then got a subclinical or low amounts of antibiotics present in animal food, present in animals, livestock animals especially, which then means you've got bacteria that are being exposed to antibiotics over a long period of time. So then you get presence of antibiotics in the environment through animal waste and then go into waterways. You've got antibiotic-resistant bacteria entering the environment. And then you've also got exposure to farm workers to these antibiotic residues as well as antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So farm workers in the US are 32 times more likely to develop antibiotic-resistant infections than the general population, which is really driven by the exposure to this, the exposure to these antibiotics and also antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, from what you're telling me, correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but so it sounds like antibiotics are put into the food for these animals with the intent of killing off the bad bacteria that they have, and then it's not enough to do that, and so the bacteria within them becomes resistant, and it's in their meat when we consume it. Is that correct? The bacteria that's resistant.
Yes, it can be present in the meat. I may be wrong, but I don't think the actual mechanism of these antibiotics being used or acting as growth promoters is really well understood. I think there are some theories as to essentially it helps control the bacterial load in these animals. So it essentially results in higher rates of conversion of animal feed to animal mass. But yeah, essentially you have this constant low level exposure of bacteria to these antibiotics, which then essentially lets these bacteria mount resistance to these antibiotics, which then causes issues. And then, you've got animal waste entering waterways, you've got animal waste being used as fertilizer, and that fertilizer can then be sprayed onto vegetables, like vegetable crops, plant crops that we consume, and that is how antibiotic-resistant bacteria can then enter how we can be exposed to antibiotic-resistant bacteria as well. They can also be present on the meat as well.
Okay, interesting. Concerning, but interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And so what measures have been introduced globally to combat these issues?
So there have been quite a few developments, which is nice, to help curb the rise of antibiotic resistance. One of these is known as antimicrobial stewardship. So essentially what stewardship looks to do is to promote the conscious or promote very, very deliberate prescription of antibiotics by clinicians. So making sure that human and animal patients are prescribed antibiotics only when they need them. Those patients receive the optimal drug for them at the correct time and the correct dose by the correct route. So, that can be oral, intravenous, in the ear, or topical, and also for the lowest effective time. So this is supposed to, I guess, the outcome of this stewardship is to reduce antibiotic resistance, enhance patient outcomes, and also decrease costs by making sure that these antibiotics are prescribed only when they need to. While stewardship is a really good, it's something we really need to improve on. We need to incorporate it more, need to really improve on it. there is, I guess there was a concerning report published in The Lancet in 2024. So this was a major systematic review or analysis of antibiotic resistance from 1991 to 2021. And then this information, or this data, they also carried out forecasts of antibiotic resistance until 2050. While we have been seeing some improvements in antimicrobial resistance, the prediction is that we might see up to 8 million deaths per year by 2050 if our current trajectory is maintained.
Wow.
But this, not to be all doom and gloom. There's a lot of, really bright, smart researchers, not including myself. They're doing a lot of work to help, combat this. So we've got bacterial vaccines being produced, or, research into bacterial vaccines, improvements in infection prevention, improvements in antibiotic stewardship. And like I was talking about before, one major part of combating antibiotic resistance is the development of new antibiotics.
Okay.
One thing that is a concern, though, is that we're seeing less major pharmaceutical companies get involved in production or research of new antibiotics, because unfortunately, production of antibiotics by these large companies is a pretty poor value proposition.
Right.
It takes a lot of money to research these antibiotics, it takes a lot of time, and then the amount of money they can make off these drugs post all this is also quite low. So a lot of the onus has fallen onto small and medium-sized research institutes, universities as well. So yeah, that is one concern. But
Right.
we're doing the best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. You're listening to Wellbeing. My guest today is Ben Hipwell from the University of Newcastle, who is a researcher in microbiology. So, what types of antibacterial resistance are there?
So bacteria are pretty crafty at actually becoming resistant to antibiotics. They've had to deal with other bacteria and also fungi in their environment, in their environmental niches that produce antibiotics for millions of years, so they've become pretty good at it. One common method of antibiotic resistance is we call inactivation or modification of the drug. And this also can be quite common with drugs like penicillin. So penicillin belongs to a class of drugs called beta-lactams, and bacteria can produce enzymes called beta-lactamases that actually breaks down the antibiotic and inactivate it. So bacteria can also modify the target of an antibiotic, also known as the binding site. So they'll modify the binding site that an antibiotic will target. So one example of this is with the drug rifampicin. And rifampicin is quite common in the treatment of tuberculosis. What's quite common in tuberculosis treatment is that they'll treat the infection with rifampicin and then a couple of other drugs as well. But so rifampicin targets a pocket in the bacterial version of the enzyme, or the bacterial enzyme called the RNA polymerase, and this binding in this pocket actually blocks its function. The bacteria can actually pick up mutations in that pocket, and then this prevents rifampicin from binding into the pocket, and then also leading to resistance. It's also, good to note that the change in the structure of this binding pocket actually doesn't really interfere with the function of the RNA polymerase as well. So the bacteria will essentially become resistant to this drug and actually not impact itself very much at all. So that's also another way that bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics. And another common method of resistance is by reducing the rate of accumulation of the antibiotic. So actually reducing the amount of drug that actually enters the cell. A major way that this sort of resistance can arise is through something called multi-drug efflux pumps. And this is actually what my research group at the University of Newcastle mostly focuses on. So these pumps can recognize multiple different classes of antibiotics, and then these pumps help to essentially spit the antibiotic back outside of the cell as soon as it enters. And the reason why these are so effective is that the way that a bacterial cell is made up is that the rates of entry of the drug into the cell is actually quite slow. But these pumps can really quickly spit the compound back out. So essentially this means that the compound can actually never enter the cell. Like I said, bacteria have got a lot of ways of mounting resistance to antibiotics and have been quite good at it because they've been doing it for a very long time.
Absolutely. No, it sounds like there's a multitude of sort of hurdles that people such as yourself need to jump over, when tackling these sorts of issues.
Yes, absolutely.
Ben, thank you so much for sharing some more information about antibacterial resistance with us. Let's move on to talking about the microbiome. So, moving away from ways that bacteria can harm us, how can bacteria help us?
Bacteria have been with us as long as we've been around. And we're so dependent for so many things. We love them, of course, for helping us make cheese, yogurt, kimchi, sauerkraut, lots of delicious foods are only possible through fermentation with bacteria. But there's an increasing body of evidence that links the bacteria in our gastrointestinal tract to both our physical and mental health.
Interesting. So how can bacteria impact our mental health?
So there's a great article that's recently published, or that was recently published in Nature, which is a pretty prestigious scientific journal,
yep.
That rounds up a lot of the research that's been done on the microbiome, or the role of the microbiome and our mental health. One of the really interesting stories that they mention is someone who had been diagnosed with severe depression. This depression was also drug resistant. So they tried medication, exercise, volunteering, meditation, all sorts of approaches, and they simply could not shake their severe depression. He approached a research group at a university, and I believe it was the University of Calgary, that were performing a clinical trial looking at the role of the fecal microbiome in people's mental health. So what happened was that they essentially flushed all the bacteria out of the system with a range of antibiotics, and essentially replaced his microbiome with the microbiome of a healthy donor through something called a fecal microbiota transplant. And then 3 weeks following this transplant, he really started to experience life-changing changes in his depression. And essentially mental fog had been relieved, depressive symptoms almost entirely gone. So really interesting stuff. So interestingly, you can also see the inverse, where if you have depressive symptoms, so if you have someone with depression, take their fecal microbiome and then transplant that into a rodent with no microbiome, well, the rodent will essentially start to exhibit depressive symptoms. And then you also see this with social anxiety and things like psychosis as well. So there's a really fascinating link between the way we feel and what's in our gut. There's scientists that are trying to figure out the role of psychobiotics, or quote-unquote psychobiotics, that are essentially probiotics that have mental health benefits for the host. There is still a lot of work to be done, though, because you have so many ways that bacteria influence and communicate with us. But on top of that, you also have so many factors that impact the microbiome. The microbiome changes essentially throughout the day, from morning to night. What you eat, when you eat, changes your microbiome. There are so many microorganisms that make up a microbiome. We're still actually unsure of what makes a microbiome healthy, and I guess there's lots of organisms in the microbiome that also have yet to be catalogued. The amount of data that has to be processed to actually get to the bottom of this sort of stuff is really quite astounding. But one thing that's promising is that the tools to interpret this data is getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. So we hopefully will start to see more and more, concrete research coming out as to how people can really positively improve the microbiome.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible that, something that isn't particularly closely related to someone's mental health can have such an impact on it, and especially something that is probably commonly overlooked in the treatment of such mental health disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the role the microbiome has, and just the way we feel from day to day is really, I guess it's been so hard to figure out what's going on inside us for so long, but hopefully we're going to start getting to the bottom of it.
Absolutely. And how can we improve our microbiome? Obviously you mentioned, those foods like kimchi and sauerkraut and so on, but is there anything else that you can think of?
There's been also alongside this research into how the microbiome can affect our health. There's also a lot of things that are coming out as to how we can help the health of our own microbiome. So things like alcohol, alcohol has a negative impact, I believe, overall on our microbiome. Things like ultra-processed foods can have poor outcomes for our microbiome, mostly, from what I understand, due to the lack of fibre.
Okay.
Improving the fibre intake, improving the amount of whole foods that we eat is super important for supplementing our microbiome, because these bacteria, these microorganisms in our gut love to eat things that we can't digest, so soluble, insoluble fibre.
Right.
So, consumption of beans, legumes, whole foods are really important. A study published in 2017 by a team in Australia found that the Mediterranean diet actually had a significant impact in reducing symptoms in people with depression. So the Mediterranean diet emphasizes plant-based foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes and whole grains, and olive oil as the main fat source, and sort of reducing reducing the proportion that red meat and processed foods make up in your diet. So diet, I think, is as far as I'm aware, the most concrete way to improve your microbiome and avoiding, minimizing your consumption of alcohol. I think those are probably the most important ways we can nourish our microbiome. Common foods you can get in supermarkets, I would say, are like, great foods are kimchi, sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, like the fermented milk drink. Those are all really great ways you can, introduce more healthy bacteria into your gut as well.
Awesome. It's it's very interesting that the Mediterranean diet was is the best for the microbiome. I'd be interested to see, what the results are on the self-reported mental health of people in the Mediterranean, given that that's, that their diet is so good.
I think that it's one other thing that as well that the microbiome research is so early is that I guess we don't have a concrete best diet. They also encourage people to, if anyone's trying to sell something as like a quick fix or like 100% fix for your microbiome, we don't have any concrete evidence to like a one size fits all solution to fixing microbiome. So definitely encourage people to be skeptical of that. But there's a lot of good evidence, just like improving your diet can have a lot of excellent impacts on your overall health, especially your microbiome. Yeah,
interesting. And what do you think of things like fiber supplements? Like Metamucil or fiber pills and that sort of thing.
I think those are really effective. I haven't seen any research on the impact of those, but I guess I haven't looked for them. But I think just the consumption of fiber, fiber wherever you can get it, whether it be from Metamucil or whole foods, will have a positive impact on your microbiome.
Okay. Presumably it'd be better from whole foods, would it not?
I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I think so. I just think that's the recommendation, but fiber is fiber. So if you're consuming, decent food and having a Metamucil to supplement your fiber intake, that's really not going to hurt.
Okay.
And keeping, maintaining regularity of bowel movements is also just a great way to improve your gut health as well. So it's going to have a positive impact no matter what it's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's interesting. So we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to finish up by asking, what developments do you foresee in the field of antibacterial resistance and, the microbiome as well? And what's next for your research?
So I think that, as like I mentioned before, I guess the cost of a lot of really powerful techniques in the biological sciences are actually dropping quite a lot. So DNA sequencing, analysis of metabolite data from both bacteria found in the gut and also human metabolites. All those ways of gathering data and gathering information is becoming a lot cheaper. So I think we're going to start to see a big upswing in terms of a big increase in the amount of research coming out, because these lowering costs are facilitating or allowing this research to be carried out. And I think with this as well, we're hopefully going to see a lot more research done on the impact of AMR or antibacterial resistance. We're going to see more research on how bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics, and hopefully this will also translate to better research on antibiotics, better research on new antibiotics that enter the market. Because that is a major way that we're going to combat antibiotic resistance.
Fantastic. So thank you for coming on the show today, Ben, and for sharing all that information with us.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
Ben Hipwell, who works at the University of Newcastle in the Bacterial Regulation and Transport Lab. I'm Guy Murphy, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.